When I first told people I was in love with someone I met online, their reactions were anything but supportive. It started with the polite, cautious smiles, the kind people give when they're trying not to look alarmed. Then came the loaded questions. How can you trust someone you've never met in person? Are you sure he's not after something? Have you even done a video call to make sure he's real? It stung more than I expected. Suddenly, I wasn't just sharing happy news, I was defending my own judgment, my own heart. It felt like every excited story I told was met with a skeptical eyebrow raise, as if everyone around me was just waiting for me to discover he was some lonely guy in a dark room with a fake accent and a collection of stolen photos. It didn't help that people seemed to delight in sharing horror stories. I heard about women who'd sent thousands of dollars to men who vanished, about men who showed up at airports only to find the person they'd been speaking to was someone entirely different. My colleagues would swap these stories over coffee breaks, laughing nervously, then glance at me with that "you're next" look. Even family members whom I loved dearly started to keep their distance from my joy. They didn't come out and say they thought I was being scammed, but it was in every cautious pause, every reluctant "well, I just want you to be careful, that's all." At first, I tried to wave it off. I told myself they didn't know him the way I did, but slowly their voices started creeping into my head late at night. Was I being naive? Was I blinded by loneliness or wishful thinking? I found myself rereading his messages, studying his photos, replaying our calls to search for inconsistencies that didn't exist. It was like I was suddenly seeing shadows in every corner. I hated that they made me doubt something that felt so pure and so right. Still, through all the side glances and whispered warnings, I held onto the one truth I knew. The way he made me feel. No scammer would care about my little daily victories the way he did, or stay up through the night just to hear my tired voice because my day was his night. No stranger looking to exploit me would learn the names of my childhood pets or remember how I liked my coffee. We shared memories we hadn't lived yet, made plans for summers on distant beaches, and laughed about growing old together. In those moments, it didn't matter that there were thousands of miles between us. He was right there, closer than anyone else had ever managed to be. But I'd be lying if I said the doubt didn't chip away at me. I'd cry after family gatherings where people made casual jokes about catfishing, or after a friend sent me yet another "watch out for romance scams" article. I tried to hide it, tried to be strong and brush it off, but it hurt. It hurt to feel like the world was rooting for us to fail, like everyone was standing by waiting to say, "I told you so." So I learned to be selective. I shared less, guarded my happiness more. Our relationship became this precious thing that I kept close to my chest, safe from the prying eyes and unsolicited warnings, in a way that made it even more intimate, because it was ours alone. But it also made me yearn for the day I could stand before them all, hold his hand and say without words, "This is real, this is love," and no amount of suspicion could ever have undone it. And little did they know that day was coming, sooner and more spectacularly than any of them could have possibly imagined. It's funny how people think that just because two people are physically close, it automatically means they're truly connected. I've known couples who shared the same home, the same bed, the same morning routine, and yet somehow felt like strangers passing each other in the hallway of life. Meanwhile, here we were, separated by oceans and time zones, yet completely woven into each other's hearts, in a way that even I struggled to explain sometimes. That's the part most people couldn't understand when they questioned our long-distance relationship. They couldn't see that being far apart actually brought us closer in the ways that matter most. Every conversation between us felt intentional. We couldn't rely on quick dinners at the same restaurant or mindless weekends on the couch to build our bond. Instead, we spent hours talking, truly talking, about everything from our childhood scars to our wildest hopes. We shared stories of who we were before life got complicated, confessed secrets we hadn't told anyone else, laughed over the embarrassing, random details that somehow became our favorite things to revisit. We explored each other's minds like tourists discovering a breathtaking city for the first time, taking in every street, every little hidden cafe, every unexpected turn. And because we weren't distracted by the physical presence, the temptation to skip the hard conversations just because a hug was easier, we dove deeper. I learned the rhythm of his voice so intimately that I could tell when he was smiling, even before he sent me a photo. He could read the tiniest catch in my breath and know if I was holding back tears. There was this one night, I remember, when I was overwhelmed by something that had gone wrong at work. I didn't want to burden him with it, so I tried to sound normal on the call, but he stopped me mid-sentence so gently and said, "Tell me what's hurting you right now." It undid me. I sobbed into the phone, thousands of miles away, yet it felt like he was holding me right there. That's a level of closeness you can't fake, and you definitely can't measure by distance. People underestimate emotional intimacy. They think love is mostly about touch, about being in the same room. But I found that love is about showing up, over and over, even when it's inconvenient. It's about being someone's safe place, even when you can't physically be there. It's about knowing that no matter what's happening around you, you have someone who cares deeply about your every win, your every fear, your every mundane detail. We built that brick by careful brick, through video calls that stretched into sunrise, through shared playlists that felt like little love letters, through surprise deliveries on hard days that made me burst into tears of gratitude. Of course, there were moments when the distance was agony. Birthdays and holidays felt especially heavy. I'd look around and see couples stealing kisses under twinkling lights, or families gathering around big tables, and ache for him to be there. But strangely, those moments of longing only deepened what we had, because every second spent missing him was a second that proved how real and powerful our connection was. If it was all just some shallow fantasy, it would have faded the moment things got hard. Instead, it grew stronger, more vibrant, more necessary. So while people on the outside were quick to label it foolish or risky, we knew better. We had a love that didn't just survive the distance, it was sculpted by it, refined into something unbreakable. And that was the foundation that would soon shock everyone who ever doubted it. Even with all the love and trust we built across countless hours of heartfelt conversations, I won't pretend there weren't dark moments when fear wormed its way in. You can't go through a long-distance relationship, especially one the whole world seems to doubt, without battling your own insecurities. And I had more than my fair share. Late at night, after we'd hung up the call and I was left alone in the quiet of my room, that's when my mind would start its cruel games. I'd replay all those warnings people had given me, hearing their voices echo in my head. Are you sure he's who he says he is? Don't you think it's strange he's so perfect? Even though my heart wanted to dismiss them outright, my brain couldn't help but dissect every tiny detail. Was that pause on the call because he was lying? Was that grainy part of a photo evidence of something suspicious? I hated how these doubts crept in, making me question the very man who had become my anchor. But it wasn't just the fear of being scammed. It was also the deep-rooted worry that maybe I wasn't enough. That maybe, once he saw me in person, saw every flaw I tried to keep hidden behind flattering camera angles and carefully chosen words, he'd realize he'd made a mistake. I'd lie awake worrying he'd get bored of the way I ramble when I'm nervous, or how I get quiet when I'm overwhelmed. That he'd think I was too emotional, too sensitive, too ordinary. It was terrifying to imagine building something so beautiful, only to watch it crumble because I couldn't measure up to the person he thought I was. These insecurities made me hyper-aware. I'd find myself overanalyzing every conversation, every text message, trying to make sure I wasn't coming across as clingy or insecure. Sometimes I'd catch myself typing out a paragraph, then deleting it entirely because I didn't want to seem needy. I was constantly trying to walk this tightrope between being open and being cool enough not to scare him off. It was exhausting, and it honestly chipped away at my confidence more than I'd like to admit. But even in those moments, he somehow always knew. Maybe it was the subtle changes in my voice, or how my replies came slower. He'd gently pull me back, asking me what was really wrong, and I'd spill it all out. My fears of not being pretty enough, not being interesting enough, not being enough, period. I expected him to reassure me with quick clichés or brush it off with a laugh. Instead, he'd listen so patiently, then tell me exactly why he fell in love with me in the first place. Not for polished photos or perfect words, but for my silly stories, my excited rants about tiny things, the way I cared so deeply about people and dreams that most would overlook. Little by little, those conversations helped rebuild my sense of self-worth. They reminded me that love isn't about presenting a flawless version of yourself. It's about being seen completely, vulnerabilities and all, and still being chosen. And ironically, those moments of raw honesty, where I laid every insecurity bare, often brought us even closer. Because he didn't just fall in love with the happy, confident parts of me. He fell in love with the scared, uncertain parts too, and held them with the same tenderness. So yes, I battled my own doubts fiercely, but every time I was brave enough to share them, it only proved to me how real what we had truly was. And in the end, that gave me the strength to keep believing, because love that survives your worst fears is love worth holding onto forever. It's almost surreal thinking back to the moment everything changed, when all the whispers and warnings that had haunted me for so long were suddenly drowned out by something so spectacular that it felt like stepping into a dream. Up until then, our love had been built on screens and voices, tiny images and pixelated smiles that were somehow more vivid to me than anything happening in my so-called real life. But I still longed for that tangible moment, the kind that could shut every doubter up without me uttering a single word. When he told me he was finally coming to see me, I felt my entire world tilt. It was a mix of euphoria and sheer terror. I'd imagined our first meeting 1,000 times, at the arrival's gate of a busy airport, or on a quiet street where he'd surprise me by standing there with that lopsided grin I knew so well. But never, not even in my wildest daydreams, did I imagine it would involve him stepping off a sleek private jet, striding across the tarmac like he'd walked right out of some impossibly romantic movie. I remember waiting there, heart thundering so loud I was sure people nearby could hear it. My palms were clammy, my mind racing with every possible insecurity. Would he still see me the same way up close? Would he pull me into his arms? Or would there be an awkward distance that no video call could have prepared us for? And then, in an instant, he was there. Taller than I'd pictured, somehow even more heartbreakingly handsome in person, with eyes that searched for me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. The moment our eyes met, it was like everything else fell away. I started laughing and crying all at once, the months of longing and worry and anticipation all bursting out of me. He didn't hesitate for a second. He dropped his bag, crossed the last few steps between us, and swept me into his arms with a force that stole the breath right out of my lungs. There were no awkward pauses, no uncertain stumbles. It felt like we'd been meeting like this our entire lives. And in that moment, surrounded by the low hum of engines and the curious glances of strangers, It didn't matter who was watching. It didn't matter what they thought. But oh, the irony of it. The very people who'd called him a scam, who'd sent me countless cautionary tales, were suddenly scrambling to process what they were seeing. It was almost comical. I caught the stunned expressions on a few familiar faces who had tagged along out of pure curiosity, probably half expecting to witness some tragic embarrassment. Instead, they saw a man who looked at me like I was his entire universe, who crossed an ocean not just with promises, but with undeniable, breathtaking action. Later, people would ask if the private jet was planned just to show off, but they missed the point entirely. It wasn't about luxury, it was about him wanting to make the distance vanish in the grandest way he could, to erase any lingering doubts not only in my mind, but in the minds of everyone who ever questioned our love. It was his way of saying, without words, I'm here. I've always meant every single thing I've told you, and I'm never going to let you stand alone again. In that powerful embrace on the runway, every ounce of fear, every late night insecurity, every cruel joke at my expense simply dissolved. All that remained was the undeniable truth standing right there before me, that love, real love, doesn't just promise, it shows up. And when it does, it leaves no room for doubt. If our first meeting was the moment that silenced the whispers, then our wedding was the moment that absolutely shattered them. Looking back, it still feels almost poetic that the very people who once snickered behind my back or offered hollow reassurances while secretly waiting for my heart to break, ended up sitting front row watching me walk down the aisle toward the man they all swore didn't exist. It was like life had arranged the perfect stage for every ounce of our love to stand in full, undeniable view. Planning the wedding was, admittedly, a whirlwind. We decided we didn't want to wait after spending so long separated by borders and doubts. Neither of us felt like there was anything left to test or prove to each other. Still, I'll never forget the way people reacted when they received the invitations. Some sounded shocked, as if they couldn't believe I'd actually go through with marrying this mystery man. A few tried to gently suggest we should have a longer engagement, and then there were those who flat out told me I was making a mistake. Even so, they all came, maybe driven by curiosity, maybe because deep down they cared about me enough not to miss what could have been a train wreck they felt obligated to brace for. But oh, how different it turned out. From the moment he walked into the venue, every single person's face seemed to register the same realization. He wasn't some shadowy figure on a screen anymore. He was there, tangible and warm, shaking hands with my cousins, laughing with my childhood friends, hugging my tearful mother. Watching him move through the crowd so effortlessly, it hit me that this was exactly where he belonged, not just by my side, but intertwined with all the people and pieces that made up my life. The ceremony itself felt like something out of a dream. As I walked toward him, veil fluttering, heart racing, his eyes locked on me with such fierce tenderness that it nearly buckled my knees. I could see everything we'd been through reflected back in his gaze. The endless late nights, the fragile hopes, the quiet promises whispered across continents. When we took each other's hands, it was as if all the weight of the past simply lifted. There were no distances left, no screens, no rumors or doubts, just us, standing there with trembling hearts, promising forever. And when we exchanged our vows, I noticed the way people dabbed at their eyes, how even the most skeptical among them seemed to soften. Because how could they not? Our words weren't just pretty declarations. They were raw, hard, won confessions of how far we'd come and how deeply we were willing to keep fighting for each other. I spoke about the nights I lay awake terrified of losing him, about the 1,000 tiny ways he made me feel seen and safe. He spoke about how he knew he'd loved me long, before we ever met in person, that the distance had only solidified the certainty burning in his chest. By the time we had our first dance, there was this quiet reverence in the room. It was like everyone finally understood that what we shared wasn't some impulsive gamble. It was a bond that had been tested by every obstacle imaginable and still stood unshaken. Later, people came up to me, faces flushed with emotion, admitting that they'd been wrong, that they'd never seen a love so palpable. It wasn't about the grandeur of the event or the lavish touches he insisted on. It was simply about how absolutely real we were. So in the end, our wedding became so much more than a celebration of our love. It was a beautiful, living answer to every doubt ever cast our way. It was proof that even the most unlikely love stories can blossom into something breathtakingly true. If there's one thing this entire journey has etched into my soul, it's how much people underestimate love, how quick they are to dismiss it if it doesn't fit neatly into their limited understanding of how it's supposed to look. For so long, I let their skepticism cloud my own certainty. I let their warnings, their cautionary tales, their smirks and pitying glances nestle into the quiet corners of my mind until they grew into full-blown fears. But standing here now, on the other side of every doubt and every lonely night, I see how wrong they all were about us, and how wrong I sometimes was to second. Guess what my heart knew so clearly from the very beginning? What I've learned is that love doesn't follow a map drawn by other people. It doesn't need their approval to be valid. It certainly doesn't need to look conventional to be meaningful. In fact, I think the most profound kinds of love often grow in the spaces where certainty is scarce and risk is high. That's where you truly learn what commitment means, when loving someone isn't just a matter of routine or proximity, but a conscious choice made again and again, across thousands of miles and countless hurdles. Through all of this, I discovered that real love isn't afraid of being tested. It welcomes the trials because they strip away every illusion and leave behind only what's unshakably true. And ours was tested more than most. It endured time zones that left us living in opposite days, missed birthdays and holidays that ached in ways I can't fully describe, and the relentless chorus of voices urging me to be wary. Yet every test we faced was another chance to prove, to ourselves most of all, that what we had was deeper than fleeting attraction or fairy tale infatuation. I also learned that love, when it's genuine, changes you. Not in the sense of losing who you are, but by expanding your capacity to trust, to hope, to forgive, to be vulnerable even when it terrifies you. Loving him forced me to confront all the insecurities I'd carefully tucked away. It made me admit how afraid I was of not being enough, how haunted I was by the possibility of being abandoned or deceived. But instead of using those fears as excuses to build walls, I found the courage to let him in completely. And in doing so, I realized that the right person doesn't see your cracks as weaknesses. They see them as the spaces where their love can pour in the deepest. Most importantly, I've come to understand that people will always judge what they don't understand. They will mock what scares them, question what challenges their own narrow experiences. But none of that matters when you're the one living the reality. None of it can diminish the quiet certainty that grows in your chest when you know you've found something extraordinary. I wish I could go back to those long nights where I lay awake wondering if we'd ever close the distance for good, and whisper to that worried version of myself that one day all of this would be so worth it, that every tear, every pang of doubt, every condescending chuckle from someone who thought they knew better would fade the moment I found myself standing next to him, hand in hand, knowing beyond any shadow of a doubt that we had built something unbreakable. So yes, they called my long-distance love a scam. They told me it would end in heartbreak, They underestimated not just him, but me and us. But looking at where we are now, at the life and love we've created together, I can say with absolute certainty, there's no greater victory than proving that the impossible love story you dared to believe in was real all along.